Всем привет, люди, это cossackhetman. Hello everybody, it's cossackhetman. It's been a while since I've made a video, but I'm back and gonna try and, well, just let my actions speak for you. So here we are, next video. This one is going to be a reductionist timeline of Cossack history, because the last time I checked in with all of you guys after announcing the end of the Cossack series and announcing that we'll be going into just covering chronologically Cossack history, got a lot of feedback from you guys saying to make a quick overline, like an overview of the entire 500-year history. And I understand why, because not everybody's going to find, not everybody will want to study absolutely everything about the Cossacks, and this way you can kind of get a feel for the different time periods and things going on, so that perhaps you can find certain eras or certain characters or certain things that you find interesting that you'd like to study or look into further, and wait for release on this channel. That way you can watch what you're interested in watching and learn what you're interested in learning about. So this has been really hard for me. I've shot it in 7 different places and like 15 different times, and it just doesn't work out. It's so hard for me to be reductionist and to like not go on tangents and just kind of give you bullet points of this really convoluted 500-year history. So here we go. Without further ado, this is a reductionist timeline of Cossack history. So the start point of Cossack history, as we've mentioned, is very convoluted, and it's argued by many different perspectives in terms of when exactly the start date is. The Western perspectives, the Russian perspectives, the Ukrainian perspectives, and a more recent one that I've discovered, the Turkic historiography perspective, all have different, wildly different start dates for the Cossacks coming into history and being known. The Turkic historiography was presented to me by one of our viewers, actually, on What is a Cossack video, where he talks about the word Cossack having potentially roots in Chipchak culture. So this is a very different perspective and school of thought that I was not aware of, so I was really happy that he brought that to my attention. So where does this get us? Arguably, the start of the Cossack history can be anywhere from potentially the 10th to the 14th centuries. For the sake of objective written history, in this video, we shall say that Cossack history starts in the early 14th century, the 1500s. And this is predominantly because this is where we actually get a larger body of evidence, written evidence from multiple cultures in regards to the Cossacks and calling them Cossacks. So that for our purposes, we'll say it's the 14th century, so the start of the 1500s. So this would be, I guess, the first plot point on the timeline in Cossack history, 1500s. The Cossacks are setting up in the West, I should say. The Cossacks are setting up their lifestyle and militarized villages in the no man's land that was between the Crimean Peninsula and the Polish-Lithuanian borders. They were granted the right by the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth to go into this land and to settle it, mainly to be kind of buffer zones between the Crimean Khanate and the Tartars there, as well as the Ottoman Empire that was creeping up into what is known as Bessarabia, so modern-day Moldova and Romania, as well as they had a heavy presence / alliance with Crimean Khanate, and ports such as Akraman, Kaffa, and Feodosia. Now, in the east, the Eastern Cossacks, at this same time period, roughly, 1500s, are getting set up along the Volga and Rostov na Donu rivers and settlements. So this is the period where the lifestyle and the mannerisms, and as well as the ideals of the Cossack peoples and their way of life is really being developed. And then once we get to the mid 1500s, this is the period of the registered Cossacks. I mentioned this before in other videos. I believe it was in part 1 and part 2 of Code Cossack. This is linked, the registered Cossack period is linked into the development of Code Cossack. And as I mentioned before, this all stems from the fact that there's a large amount of banditry and bandit groups, as well as mercenaries, that were committing atrocities and pillaging all these areas, the no man's land areas, Crimea, and the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth as well. So thus enters in this period of time of the registered Cossacks, where these initial Cossacks are under the umbrella of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth in the West. So this period of time can kind of be construed as the Wild West period. This is when a lot of daring raids and somewhat colloquially crusades against the Ottoman Empire and the Crimean Khanate are occurring by the Cossacks in the West. The burning of Constantinople that happened twice, sieges of Akraman, attacks on Jaffa to free slaves. These are all some really wild events that occurred. This is when Western European eyes are now more predominantly on Cossacks, who are gaining reputation in the West as kind of being these new crusaders against the Muslim state. And yeah. As a result of all these kind of wild, daring skirmishes and battles going on in the West, the Cossacks themselves gain a lot of reputation and cultural identity through these events. And as a result, they start having some occasional rebellions against the Polish-Lithuanian state in the late 1500s. This is because their autonomy and their rights on occasion were being suppressed and in some cases completely revoked when they'd go and they would loot and take prizes and conquer new sections of land. It would all be ceded to the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth itself and taken away from the Cossacks, who in their mind now, after having so many successful campaigns and really proving not only to other Western European countries, but also mainly themselves, that they were a capable military force and naval force that could really contend with the powers in the region. All of a sudden they start asking themselves essentially an internal dialogue of, well, why are we giving this away? Why are we not conquering and holding these resources and lands for ourselves? Why are we not governing ourselves, especially at this point in time where they're establishing their own way of life, their own culture, their own mannerisms and ideology in the form of Code Cossack? So this is really where this dialogue is starting to be developed that will lead into the next period of time. So that's in the West. Meanwhile, in the East, with the Eastern Cossacks, there's a lot of tribal warfare going on in the Caucasus and in what is in modern-day south-central Russia. And this brings them into contact with the Principality of Muscovy and the Ottoman Empire, Armenians, a lot of different ethnic groups and small empires and conglomerates. And this will eventually start shaping their way of life, as well as their conflicts that they will have in the upcoming years, and kind of where their allegiances will lie. So now, this is the second plot point on the timeline. We're entering the mid-1600s. As the time has progressed from the period I just talked about, the mid-1600s is a time of rebellion and civil war and just a crazy amount of bloodshed and conflict. It's the Khlementsky rebellion in 1648. This is a huge kind of epic period of time for Ukrainian nationalists, as this is kind of, it's argued this is where the rise of the and the establishment of the Ukrainian identity and the Ukrainian statehood goes back to and arises from. And on the flip side, it's kind of a sad time for the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth that gets kind of split right down the middle, and divided amongst the gentry versus the peasants, and kind of lower noblemen that are Cossacks. So there's, like I said, there's fighting everywhere in this geographical region, on every and factions are constantly switching sides at almost every single battle, for the sake of who's going to grab more land and more resources. The Tartars especially had a really bad reputation during this time period, because they were constantly switching sides between assisting the Cossacks against the Poles, assisting the Poles against Cossacks, and assisting Ottoman Empire against the Poles and the Cossacks, and it was just a giant cluster. But as a result from this chaos and this warfare, this is where the Cossacks in the West really are cement their legendary status, especially in history later on. They're working on their battle tactics and the training of Cossacks, as well as Code Cossack really gets set in stone and practiced on a political and a social level, and really a sense of culture, and especially visually speaking, this is kind of where a lot of Cossack iconography comes into place, with like the Osaladets hairstyle, the pantaloons, the muskets, the shamshir swords, this sort of thing. Meanwhile, in the east, this is where we see the first kind of alliances happening with the Eastern Cossacks with the Principality of Muscovy, and they're mutually assisting each other with conquering the entire expanse of south-central Russia, Dagestan, expanding, and the Caucasus as well, and kind of expanding their influence within what will then be the Russian Empire, and as well as starting a lot of rebellions as well against the certain Tsars. And like I said, this has to do with their growing influence on the lower classes of society that happen to be the most numerous as well. So they could really be a powerful force to have on your side come, well, it wouldn't be election time, but come taking the throne, assuming power. Having these Eastern Cossacks on your side would be a real benefit towards successfully maintaining and achieving authority. So after this second period of time, which is the mid-1600s to the 1700s, that we, I guess, would just call the Civil War, the crazy bloodshed era, I guess. Then it's a period of time, this is the third plot point, that would be known as the Ruin, we'll call it. So after the Khlementsky rebellion in the West, there's three huge political treaties that occur to kind of end all of this bloodshed that was going on. And it's largely debated to this day the conditions and the outcomes that these treaties specified, especially the Treaty of Pereyaslav, because for Russian politicians and then Russian narrative and historiography, this is when the Cossacks entered into a coalition and assimilated into the Principality of Muscovy, joining the lands that they controlled as well as the forces that they had, to mutually bolster the Principality of Muscovy and expand the power of both parties and assist in conquering the rest of the region. However, Ukrainian nationalists see this completely the other way, in terms of this is, the Treaty of Pereyaslav and the other treaties had set into motion the Cossack statehood, known as the Cossackhetmanate, and apparently from their perspective, it was a mutually agreed coalition, kind of like, I guess, NATO, where an attack on one is attack against all. The Cossacks were looking for protection from Moscow or Muscovy against the Poles, the Ottoman Empire, and the Tartars, and they did a mutual military cooperation, and in exchange for the recognition of their lands as autonomous and as their own, essentially, officially recognizing them as a state, as an identity. It's during the Russification of the Cossack lands in the early 1700s that we get another legendary Cossack historical figure, Ivan Mazepa. Ivan Mazepa was operating on the Western Front in and around Ukraine, central Ukraine, Crimea, Belarus, Poland, and he was leading the Russian Imperial forces as well as his own Zaporozhian Cossack units. Now, for one reason or another, Mazepa became unhappy with the relationship between the Cossacks and the Muscovy. And he saw an opportunity when the war between Sweden and Russia broke out during this time period. The king of Sweden was actually campaigning with his troops through the northern part of Ukraine at this point in time. And Mazepa saw this as an opportunity for himself and his Zaporozhian Cossacks to regain the kind of autonomy and independence that they had under the Cossackhetmanate in 1648 with Khlementsky. So this is where we see Mazepa ally with Sweden, and they lose badly during their campaign and are utterly defeated at the Battle of Poltava. And this is where we get the West and the split between Western and Eastern Cossack brotherhoods. As I've mentioned before, briefly in a video on, I think it was part 3 of Code Cossack, where this battle was one of the prime examples where brothers were killing brothers. The Eastern Cossacks were fighting the Western ones, and essentially they had completely broken that tenet of Code Cossack. So the fallout of this, the Western, these Zaporozhian Cossacks, they break up. A lot of them go westward and go to Bendery and are in exile with Ivan Mazepa. And then a few years later, in Bendery, which is in modern-day Moldova, the Bendery Constitution is written by Pilipa Orlica. And again, I covered this in one of my Code Cossack videos because it's a very important one. Meanwhile, there's some remnants from the Zaporozhian Cossacks that split off and went eastwards, and they end up founding some of the Cossack hosts, the Kuban Cossack hosts, the Azov Cossacks, and this ends up bolstering the Eastern Cossack hosts and further develops and strengthens their position within the region and by extension, their relationship with Muscovy. So as a result from these swelling ranks, these Eastern Cossacks then go and launch huge conquests of the Urals, Siberia, Kamchatka, Mongolia, Kazakhstan, fighting against the Finns, the Swedes, also subduing the populace in Dagestan and Georgia, these areas. There's many more that I could list in here, but I just don't want to get this video to be too long. Then after this period of time, now we're into like the mid 1700s. Then another legendary character in Cossack history arises, and that is Pugachev. Now, similar to the narrative that happened quite a few hundred years back with the Western Zaporozhny Cossacks and the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, now that dialogue is happening with the Eastern Cossacks and the Imperial Tsars, in terms of, well, these Cossacks are proving to themselves and to others to be very capable and formidable military components. Being able to, they conquered all this land, and again, they're giving it up to the Tsars, to these upper nobles, and they're not able to keep any land or resources for themselves, and they want more for themselves. They feel like they should be entitled to this, given the fact that they've put their blood and their sweat for this. So as a result, this puts them at odds with the nobles, and at the time, this is when Catherine the Great was ruling. So however, by the Cossacks of the period, at the time period, she was known as Catherine the Whore. So it kind of tells you where their minds were at. So Pugachev launches this huge rebellion that sweeps the nation. Hundreds of thousands of people join him, and they almost win, except for the fact that since the majority of those rebelling are from the peasantry, they didn't have anybody tending the fields, and it causes a huge famine that destroys a majority of the nation as well as their forces, and they are defeated outside the gates of Moscow by Catherine the Great and her forces that were well equipped, well fed, and were able to just outlast these enemy forces. So then this would be the next plot point in this time period I'd like to call the Hammer of Vengeance. So this is where Catherine the Great, she recognizes how powerful the Cossacks had become and how much sway that they had over the general population, and even creeping now into the imperial court, let alone just the peasantry. So she comes down very hard on the Cossacks, and she goes 1775 and burns down the Sich in Ukraine to completely stomp out any hopes of kind of a revival of the Cossack state in the west, as well as really subdues all the remaining Cossacks in the east. And what she ends up doing after crushing the rebellion and then burning the Sich is any Cossacks remaining, she gathers them all up and forcibly relocates all of them to the outer frontiers of the empire, and also injects new Cossacks, literally just picked from the populace, and forms these new hosts that, there's some hosts that are completely created from scratch, and have no they don't trace their lineage back to either the Western or Eastern original Cossack hosts, as well as, like I said, some of these original hosts then get bolstered and with new blood, fresh blood, in these new regions that they've been forced to settle in, kind of as a way to diminish the Cossacks' powers by isolating them so that they can't form a very large conglomeration of forces. That way she could always keep them in check with imperial forces. If anything, they'd be less likely to be able to create large-scale rebellions. So this leads into the 1800s and the fourth plot point, kind of the imperial Cossacks. So this is after they've gone through this reformation, and now they have these strict stanitsas and like military camps, kreposts, also another word for them. So this is where Cossacks are more frontiersmen, vanguards, bodyguards for the Tsar, really and then they're starting to cement their position as kind of a military caste and gentry in the Russian Empire, and through just enough years and gaining the kind of having to win the trust of the imperial family back at this point in time. And so that this occurs throughout the entirety of the 1800s. Some highlights in terms of battles and that sort of thing from this period would definitely be the Russo-Japanese, or the Russo-Sino War, as they call it. The Cossacks were involved there. The Crimean War that happened between the British Empire and the Russian Empire in the Crimea in the late 1800s there. Quite a few further big battles, and but overall, generally speaking, pretty quiet period of time. However, like I said, their role has completely shifted to being enforcers rather than fierce, independent kind of rebel rousers. So they've taken a different turn, historically speaking. And then this leads into the fifth plot point, which would be the World War I Revolution and Civil War period. So much happens in here. Again, crazy amount of characters. There's lots of books now, written primary sources from these individuals. So their involvement in World War I, especially as really one of the last cavalry uses of, like, practical uses of cavalry in what was being developed as the modern theater of war and the modern version of warfare. The revolution, their involvement there, and then especially the Civil War, their heavy involvement on supporting the white imperialist army, and then of course, as history dictates, they lost that struggle, yet it's still very interesting to delve into and study all the battles and the leaders, and very interesting. So then this goes into the kind of the second last plot point, which would be the World War II and Decossacization period. So World War II, there's a few Cossack hosts that were allowed to operate in the Red Army under Stalin, but however, Stalin, for the most part, eventually passes this Decossacization law that essentially gets rid of Cossacks, and most are, put in detention camps, killed, or forcibly deported, and for the most part, just trying to get. It was not good for kind of the Soviet mentality. Can get into that when we need to. So this kind of leads into the next small plot point, which is just the Soviet era, kind of depression, death, deportments, like I said. And then this leads into the last plot point, which is 1991, the revival and repatriatization of the Cossacks by Boris Yeltsin. Their rights and some of their lands being granted back to them, schools being reopened, and their way of life being ushered back in to the modern Russian state and kind of character building. And then this leads into, the modern historical events and kind of their current role as rural police and mercenaries in what would I say, controversial modern battlegrounds, such as Chechnya, Abkhazia, Crimea, Dagestan, Tatarstan, and kind of their anti-terrorist, their role there. So yeah, that's the last plot point there. So like I said, it's pretty hard for me to be a reductionist, but like I hope that this timeline will give you an accurate kind of and short context of this rich 500-year history of these people, and their role in history of many different nations, and some of the big things that occurred during this 500-year period. And hopefully you find one of these plot points, as I call it, interesting, and that you'd like to delve into it a little bit further, because we will be exploring everything from the 1500s up until modern day, all the different types of events, characters, heroes, and like battle tactics and everything. And oh, and please let me know down in the comments below kind of which plot points spike your interest the most. That way I can kind of perhaps prioritize certain time periods for releasing videos. So as always, Sili Chesva, strength and honor. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you on the next one.